Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and there are many heroes of Jewish life today about whom many of us know very little. You know, the Jewish world is made up of countless little circles of activity. And as is true of life in general, each of us tends to be very familiar only with the circles we're involved with. And often we know nothing of the other little circles. And that's true of Jewish life as well. So on this edition of L'Chaim, I'd like to introduce you to a man who's part of the contemporary Jewish journey from the former Soviet Union to lands of Jewish freedom, to Israel, to America, to make an enormous and most loving contribution to those heroic Jews who came to the United States from the FSU, the former Soviet Union. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to Rabbi Aryeh Katzin, founder of Sinai Academy, a junior high and high school for Russian immigrants, founder and editor of Yevreysky Mir, a Russian language weekly newspaper which in English means Jewish World. And now Aryeh Katzin is also the executive director of RAJE, the wildly successful Russian-American Jewish experience, which has done fabulous work in exciting Jewish engagement among young Jews from the former Soviet Union, many of whom have parents from the FSU who had no understanding of or commitment to active participation in Jewish life. RAJE changes all of that for them. And Aryeh Katzin is also something of a media celebrity in the Russian-speaking community. He hosted his own weekly radio program for Voice of America, reaching an audience of millions in the former Soviet Union. He currently is heard weekly on the leading Russian language radio station in America, Davidson Radio. And in the early 1990s, when I was privileged to help create the first Russian language television channel in America, RTN, the Russian Television Network of America, Aryeh Katzin joined me to host a Jewish weekly series on RTN called, in English, Tree of Life. And it's a program Aryeh has continued to produce and host to this very day. And Aryeh is not only a treasured colleague, he is also a dear, dear friend of more than 20 years, and a human being for whom I have the highest regard and affection. And it is so wonderful to have you sitting here on L'Chaim. Thank you, my dear friend.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you. Thank you for amazing introduction. I'm honored, and it's my opportunity to express my greatest appreciation, gratitude to you for the program Tree of Life. That is part of my life, and you enabled me to communicate with so many of brothers and sisters of my Russian Jewish community here in America. And probably the most, on a personal level, the sweetest words of your introduction, believe it or not, FSU. Do you know why?
Why?
Because the word F means former.
Yes.
And I'm so happy that Soviet Union is in the past, and we are in the present, Mark, and in the future.
You're wonderful. All right, I first want to just talk a little bit about you and your remarkable story. First of all, where were you actually born?
I was born in Moscow.
So you are a Muscovite Jew.
Right.
Okay.
Which means I knew absolutely nothing about being Jewish.
So when you're born into a family, no Jewish experience at that
Absolutely.
point.
The only Jewish experience I had, which probably the most important Jewish experience, that my mother, a blessed memory, used to tell me, you are a Jew.
She did tell you?
She did tell me, you're a Jew. More than that. Even though obviously the intermarriage was all over us and our families, obviously, and many people say, you know what, don't tell your son that he's a Jew, because you see, we need to raise people, Soviet citizens, you don't want them to be discriminated. So many relatives actually advise us to do the opposite. But my mother was very proudly Jewish, and she said, you know what, when anybody will come to you and ask you who you are, you answer, you're a Jew. Believe it or not, it was 3 years old when I was asked by a neighbor question, who are you? Because my mother asked him. And I was answering, I am Jewish, but I didn't know what it means. Mm-hmm. And later on, I was to discover.
My understanding is, by the way, the word Jew was put on passports.
Absolutely.
Did you have a passport that said Jew?
It was actually even before, because when you go to school, in your journal they write a Jew, and there are many other jokes that they discover who you are and they remind you, even if you want to forget. In a way, my discovery about Jewishness was very, I would say, maybe paradoxical in some ways. I was very interested in politics in general, and I remember myself being like 13 years old. It was like real my bar mitzvah time. And what happened was, my grandmother, who was a very good, famous music teacher in Moscow, she received a present. And this present changed my life. The present was a shortwave radio receiver. I don't know if we had this particular toy at home, but when one of her students gave this, for some reason I started listening. And by the way, we talk about power of media and power exactly what we're doing right now. And I started trying to hear the voices that were actually jammed by the Soviet police or whatever, Soviet army. And one of the voices was Voice of America. Interesting, that paradoxical that I was later on working, became one of the Voice of America. Another one, Voice of Israel. And sometime in October of 1973, I heard that Israel was attacked. I knew I was Jewish. I knew that it was a Jewish state. But somehow I had mixed messages, because some of my relatives used to say, oh, Israel is an ally of America. You know what it means? Ally of America, it means an enemy. Israel is an enemy. This is what I heard from people around me, in my own family. But when I heard that Israel is attacked and about maybe even be destroyed, in danger, because these were the first minutes, days of the war, I came to my grandmother and asked her, what Israel means for you? And even though she was a musician, as I said, and she was like very assimilated Jew and like nothing Jewish about her at all, she said, you know what, I remember myself sitting on my father's lap and saying, and she said in Hebrew, Leshana haba Birushalayim. First time I heard next to you in Jerusalem. She explained what it is. And I was so moved, and I asked, and what do you think about it? She said, well, only if I could, I would walk there myself. I would not fly or drive. I would walk there, only it would be possible for me to go to Israel. Such a love for Israel I felt at that moment from my grandmother. And I realized only now that it was passed from generation to generation, despite communists, despite Holocaust, despite Inquisitions, despite all of that, from my great-grandfather who had never saw, who told her that when she was 5 years old, as she said to me. And then communism came, and the revolutions came, and World War II, and everything else. And still, when I asked her, what do you think about Israel? She said, what? Next year in Jerusalem, I would walk there now, if I could. I remember New Year's of 1973, when 73 was turning into 74. And I was sitting near the, Russian table. I don't need to tell you in our audience, the New Year's tree, right, the champagne, and the toast, L'chaim. And everybody was saying L'chaim. So even though I was like 13 years old, I was just turned 13, they told me, okay, say L'chaim. Like, what is your wish? And at the family gathering, I said, Leshana ba Birushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And I made my business to remind everybody around me, my mother and everybody around myself, that really from that moment on, my goal became Jerusalem.
How did your family react, by the way, when you said that?
Well, I think my mother...
Forgive me. I didn't ask you about your father. You've mentioned your mother and
Right.
you've mentioned your grandmother. It is striking. You have not mentioned your father.
It is very typical Russian family. My father disappeared when I was about 2 years old.
You didn't know him?
We knew him a little bit here and there, and reappeared in different parts of time. And we are very friendly right now. Right now he lives in Germany, Berlin. And we very frequently speak, but we had like 30 years break in the relationships.
So you were raised by your mother
by
and
mother and grandmother, yeah,
okay.
and great-grandmother. Yeah,
Okay.
so it's a very Jewish, Russian Jewish story. Yeah, but my mother reacted with fear. The first reaction was fear, obviously. And she said, oh no, like we eat the bread of this land. And people who immigrate, they endanger the lives of other Jews who stay. That was her first reaction. But I have to give her right away the credit that when I was about to go to college, to university, and obviously all the doors were closed for Jews except for one or two, and one of the places I went was Telecommunicational Institute. I was about to become a radio engineer. And if I was only one person in my school, in my class, a Jew, I was one Jew in a class. When I entered this university, this college, out of 40, 20 were either open or hidden Jews, because they had nowhere to go. So it created concentration. What they wanted to exclude us from Russian life, but by definition, what they did, they forced us to be together. The togetherness already brought the sense of belonging, and that's how I first went to Moscow synagogue. I was introduced to other people, some of my teachers, and my mother said, I'm scared. You're going to Torah class? I'm scared. And she said, only over my dead body. She said to me, you're not going to go there. And then I challenged her back and said, you know what if I'll bring this class to us? And she said, under my supervision, yes. I.e. the Shabbat. She did not know what she was getting into.
By the way, you mentioned at one point, this is happening around you're becoming bar mitzvah age.
Right.
You did not have a ceremony of any kind.
I didn't know what shul is. I didn't know what Pesach, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, anything.
Nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. Jews of the former Soviet Union, they did not identify as Soviet Jews. When we say there's the Soviet Jewry movement, for them, they were Jews who happened to live in the former Soviet Union, but it was not easy for them in terms of identity to be as Jews. Then they come to America, and everybody calls them Soviet Jews, as if Jews is the noun. For the people, most of the people I know, although they don't make an issue of it, it's ironic to them because they don't feel themselves as Soviet Jews. We are American Jews. We are Jews fully integrated into the American experience. But as Jews living in the former Soviet Union, you and your mother and even your grandmother who had this attachment to a vision of Jerusalem.
Right.
You were not living a Jewish life in the former Soviet Union, and if anything, it created problems for your mother. And I was going to ask you, before you become formally involved, you're a child, 12, 13, 14, do you ever confront anti-Semitism because you're a Jew? So talk about those two things. The identity of Jews who lived in the former Soviet Union, and then about yourself personally. And did you ever have to live with anti-Semitism?
I think, first of all, you're very much on the ball, target on this comment. And I think that Jews, when they came in the 70s and 80s, and they were called not only Soviet Jews, they were called the Russians.
Yes, Russian Jews.
Russians, not even Jews, Russians.
Russians.
So when Jews hear the word Russians, and they lived among the Russians, and they were, how to say, target of anti-Semitism and discrimination by the Russian people. Unfortunately, it went beyond Soviet system.
Yes.
It was also very much in the culture.
Yes.
So they felt offended.
Yes.
I suffered as a Jew among the Russians.
And now you're calling me
Russian.
Russian.
And now you call me Russian. That was, I think they got used to
Yes.
last 20,
Yes.
30 years, of course. But you see...
and by the way, that is why I always say Russian-speaking Jews. They
wonderful.
are not Russian Jews.
Maybe even Russian Jews is less of a problem.
But certainly Russians.
Yes, some
Yeah.
Russians.
A Russian community.
Russians, I would say even Ukrainians, by the way, as well. I think if you will call a Ukrainian non-Jew a Russian, he will say, what do you mean? I'm a Ukrainian or someone from Belarus. People have different identities. Russia, the Soviet dictatorship, the regime, used Russian language, Russian culture in order to suppress everything else and basically to mold them by force.
Okay.
Therefore, they rejected this notion of being Russian.
Anti-Semitism in your life, early life, early.
I think it's a blessing. Anti-Semitism was a blessing. It wasn't a blessing. Looking at this backwards is a blessing. As a matter of fact, I think just maybe as a hint for Passover is we eat the matzah and the moror, and the moror is, and I want to thank you, but what's the amazing Passover Seder we did together 25 years ago.
With your son.
With my son. So it's very interesting that in the beginning we eat bitter herbs. It reminds us about how horrible it was, correct? How bad it was. But then later on, when we finish the story, we then, instead of beginning from bitterness to sweetness, we eat matzah, and then we eat the bitter herbs, and then we eat it together. And when we eat it together, we recline and celebrate. And the rabbi said that the reason is because now we're looking back, and they say, that was bitter then, but it reminded me something I wanted to forget. And therefore I'm reminded. So looking at me, of course, I was reminded that I was a Jew, and people came to me and asked, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? You want to? They say beef, no? That's called the beef in America, no? You want to fight? Are you Jewish? But I think most stunning experience actually was when I was about to get into Moscow University. It was the most prestigious academic institution in the former Soviet Union, and the exams were a month before anything else. Therefore, everybody from the entire country could try. Otherwise, you need to choose either one. And it was some, astronomical amount of people, maybe like 100 people competing for one seat, so to speak. And there were a few tests. Math, I successfully passed. Another math, oral math, I also successfully passed. Physics was not a problem. My favorite subject was physics. And then Russian language. Very simple. You just need to write an essay. By the time we came to the essay, from 100 people with one seat, was no competition whatsoever. They said to us, you know what? Everybody already was filtered out. You, let's say 100 people that stay in the room, you all will be accepted. The only thing you need to do, don't fail the essay. That's all. Oh, my mother was so happy. Now my son will be in the prestigious Moscow University studying physics. He's going to be a scientist. It's a dream of a Russian mother. And when I finished my essay, I came to my mother. I said, it was the best essay in my life. Oh, such, we already were anticipating. and then it was failure. It was failure. And my mother said, I cannot believe that the result was failure. And we need to appeal it. There's a mistake. So there is a process how you appeal. You come to a particular room, and there is a line of people standing to appeal. And when we come to this line, at the end of the line, and we see maybe 30 families standing on line, or 20 families standing on line. But again, parents with their children. And they all looked at us and said, oh, look, there is another Jew. Every single person standing in line was Jewish. When my mother realized that, she really experienced a shock. She was shocked and stunned. And when we came home, she was crying with tears and crying. I don't know how to translate it in English, but she was saying, Mать оказалась мачехой. The mother turned to be a stepmother. Not stepmother. Stepmother.
Yeah.
It's a meaning that she thought it's a motherland, but she felt rejected. That moment we decided to immigrate, thanks to the anti-Semitism. If not for that, I don't know if I would be speaking to you today.
This is fascinating. Oh my, how life works. But my understanding is that you joined the activist movement in the 70s, 1977.
Correct.
Okay. And how did that happen for you?
Well, it was so natural because when the Jews got together in this college, technical, radio electronic engineering.
That's where you went instead of Moscow.
Exactly, because then we needed just to understand the reality. You cannot go where so you need to go where you will be accepted. And there, Jewish community. And there's an underground. In other words, then it's already my Jewish life, like, wow. They invited me to come to, my friends invited me to come for Rosh Hashanah. That's why I was invited right away to go up to Rosh Hashanah to Moscow.
But you know nothing about this still.
I know nothing, and I was so bored. I came, there's also old people, and I thought I'm never going to go there again.
At the Moscow synagogue.
Yeah, but one guy told me, you know what, maybe you'll come with me to Yom Kippur, to a small shul. Today is a big shul of Marina Rocha, but then it was like a very little house, like wooden house. And I came, and this person, said to me, maybe you want to study Hebrew. And I said, yeah, why not? And he said, but you know what, I'm going to have to pass some military test by the Russian army. So they are putting me into it's called a mental health institution to diagnose, am I crazy? Can I serve in the army? And he said, come to me and we will study Hebrew. And I came to him to study Hebrew. So I was sitting on the bench, studying
Where
Aleph.
was this? Literally.
It was Moscow.
But where? I mean, what building?
It was actually outside the building on the bench.
Of the mental institution?
Of the mental institution, yeah. I came, how to say, lunatic asylum, that means. So, paradox. I'm taking my first Hebrew lesson, sitting on the bench at a mental institution among crazy people. Can you imagine this?
Was he crazy?
This I hope not.
Okay.
I hope not.
Right.
But anybody who's studying Hebrew, then the question maybe is not normal.
Okay. Also, I thought it was forbidden to study Hebrew or Torah.
Absolutely, of course. But he didn't say we're going to study Hebrew. He just told me privately, come and we'll do it. He was my age. And I came to him, he was sitting on the bench. He said, this is Aleph, this is Bey, this is Gimel, this is Dalet. We came to the fourth letter. Oh, by the way, he's my friend. And I see an older gentleman with beard comes and introduces himself and says, oh, I came to visit my friend, and his name was Eliyahu Essas. Someone by the name Eliyahu Essas. He was a famous refusnik.
Yes.
He was a mathematician.
But you didn't know who he was?
I didn't know who he is, except that I saw. And it's really mind-boggling what I saw. I'm still inspired by what I've seen. One of the first experiences of Jewish life in this Moscow Telecommunication Institute, that someone gave me. Do you know the word samizdat? The samizdat word means it's a concept in Russia because the freedom of press was absolutely non-existent. People were simply printing on typewriter or reprinting something on typewriter. There were no copy machines. So the only thing that was actually the only way they were able to reprint books or reprint. So Eliyahu Essas was an editor of Tarbut magazine in Moscow, which was underground magazine of Jewish culture. That's why I do Еврейский мир. I continue that way. And someone gave me these pages. And when I opened these pages, usually taking and reading these pages really meant danger because you do something illegal. But reproducing it meant jail. So when I looked at this and I started reading, and the first time I heard the word Jewish culture, Torah, Jewish holidays, and it was done in a beautiful, intelligent, and inspiring way. So I was reading these pages, I was eating these pages, but the front page made the most impression on me. It was saying like this: dear reader, there are different magazines. They are Russian, Ukrainians, Moldovans, Tatars, and others. Every nation in our country, based on the Constitution, has the right to have their own culture and their own magazine. This is your Jewish magazine. This is your constitutional right. Read it openly and proudly. Don't hide it under the pillow. Editor, Eliyahu Essas, Chesavaya Street, House 20, Apartment 10. He's giving his address. He's saying, please come and arrest me, put me in jail. And I said to myself, what a proud person he was. I mean, he is that he was doing it. The truth is, he realized that if he would hide this, they would come to him anyway. So he put it in the open, come and arrest me. And he actually was able to escape arrest for many years. He was for many years waiting for permission to immigrate, and meanwhile he was teaching Torah and Judaism to many people around him. So I knew who he was, and here he is in front of me. And to tell you the truth, from the moment I felt that I'm Jewish and I want to immigrate to Israel, as my grandmother told me, I did discover there is a building of synagogue, something to do with Jewish culture, Jewish religion. I didn't know exactly what it was. But every time I came, nobody was there, and a few older people just were chasing younger people away. Probably they were scared because teaching religion to younger people was a crime. So no one ever spoke to me. And here I see an intelligent person, and I just told him, like, I didn't scream to him, but I said, you know, like I was waiting for this moment. I would like to help you. I told him I would like to help you. And like he was very calm and said, what do you know? What do I know? I already know 4 letters of alphabet. He said, then you need to help yourself first. So a few weeks later, on Shabbat, Subota, I came to Moscow synagogue, not inside, because inside was a KGB, under control of the KGB. Outside, people were gathering in the afternoon. And indeed, it was the only real place of some kind of organized, not exactly anti-Soviet, but it was organized not with the line of the party movement. Jews were movement. Sakharov used to come there, and many other, not only Jews came, because it was the only place where people can actually speak to their friends who were not, brainwashed communists. So like a few hundred people were standing outside. I found my new friend, Eliyahu Essas, and I came to him and said, you know what, I heard that you give classes on Thursday nights. I would like to join. And he said to me, I'm sorry, I teach only teachers. Can you imagine my disappointment? I said, why? And he said, you understand, we have 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union, and this government practices cultural genocide. They want to destroy us culturally, assimilate us by force. And if I'm going to teach 5 or 10 or 100 students, it will not make any difference. I teach teachers who will teach teachers and who will teach teachers and teach teachers. So what should I do? Okay, I'm going to give you a teacher who will teach you, and when you're ready to become a teacher and teach others, come back to me. And this is what I did. He gave me a wonderful teacher who was actually an actor. I don't know if the name Rykin tells you anything. It was like one of the most famous actors at that time and even today in current Russian scenery, Konstantin Rykin, in a theater called Современник. And believe it or not, one of his biggest actors, famous actors, Zorik Filer at the time, he became observant. And he became a Hebrew teacher. And suddenly, to my home, like one of the biggest actors of the Soviet Union comes to teach me Hebrew. Can you imagine this? And we also invited another family. We were sitting together around the table. And this famous actor turns to me and says, I'm about to teach you Hebrew, but I want you to know something. We Jews do not learn Hebrew. We need to remind ourselves something we knew. This is in our souls. I'm going to teach you that you deep down know it. Because every child, before he was born, there's a Talmudic story about that, he learned everything. You're going to touch something that's deep inside you. You know it. And that's how we started our first lesson of Hebrew. And about a month, when I already covered like 4 classes, I came back to Essas. No, I didn't even come back to him. No, I started regularly coming to Shabbat, to the synagogue, to outside of the synagogue. And he suddenly called me and said, oh, look at this. You see, this is PhD professor and his family, wife and children. They do want to go to America. Dmitry Finkelstein, I remember him. But they're looking for a Hebrew teacher. Teach them. And you come to me. The reward of teaching them would be, I'm going to come to his class. Okay, I was a college student of, 18 years old or 17 years old. I just turned 17. I was 17 years old college student, and there was a 45 maybe professor. And I started teaching them Hebrew. I said, how can I do it? I just, okay, you learn lesson number 5, and you teach him lesson number 1. And then you're number 6, and you're number 2. And that's how you go. That's how I learned Hebrew also. it helped me as well. And then I already joined this group, his class, and later on my mother said, over my dead body, and this class moved to us. Yosef Begun.
Comes to your house.
Oh, of course, he out of jail. It was second time in jail, and he came to our home. He opens. It was in the middle of the winter. I remember opening the door, and a man was like a snowman because a lot of snow in Moscow, and he says, "My name is Yosef Begun."
You knew who he was.
Of course, the whole country knew who he was. KGB knew who he was. He was not allowed to be in Moscow. He was supposed to live 100 kilometers away. He was not allowed to sleep in Moscow. We gave him, obviously, we helped, whatever it is. But he
came to your house
to
study with you.
Absolutely, with the Essas group, and then became very close friend. And of course, yes.
That's amazing.
Very close friend.
That's amazing.
And YuliyEdelstein first time was arrested in our house when the Hanukkah party.
No.
In 1979.
Describe that moment.
Well, I would say there's a huge difference between 79 and 80. 79, the Soviet Union still was in detente mode with the United States. And therefore, I just made a Hanukkah party. And
wasn't that illegal?
Yeah, but it was not, okay, I wanted to make a Hanukkah party. I didn't know what Hanukkah yet, still a lot. It was like the beginning, I didn't know much. But what I did know is that I want someone to speak.
Did you have a menorah?
Yeah, of course, but I didn't know what it means. I knew nothing what it means. I said to myself, you know what, if I'm inviting my friends for Hanukkah, someone needs, for goodness sake, to say something about the holiday I knew nothing about. So what to do? I took a taxi. I believe it was maybe after Shabbat or maybe even on Shabbat. I don't remember. I didn't know any difference at that time yet. And I drove in a taxi to Moscow synagogue. And it was, as usual, people standing. I believe it was probably Shabbat maybe turning into whatever it is, fading away, going away. And I just asked around, is anybody able to come to me? Because I invited my friends, my college students, a professor of my college who was Jewish. I invited just my regular Jews, maybe like 30, 40 people in my home. And I asked, does anybody know anything about Hanukkah? Can come and tell us a story. What is that? And someone said, oh, look at this tourist. Look at this tourist. Maybe he knows. And I saw a person stands, looked like a tourist, a young fellow, maybe like in his 20s. And I came to him with my broken English. I asked if he knows about Hanukkah. He said yes. I asked him, would you come and speak to Russian Jews about Hanukkah? And he bravely said yes. He didn't know who I am. And he said yes. So taxi was waiting. We got on the taxi. I remember we were going in Moscow. I know that you don't know Moscow, but we were going on the Red Army Street. And I told them, oh, these are the headquarters of the KGB army. It's not KGB headquarters, but there were barracks of the KGB. And here's the infamous Lefortovo political jail where Stalin, killed probably thousands, if not more, people, underground city. I was introducing him to Moscow. Here's my home. And we came to my home. And I remember he started speaking about Hanukkah in Hebrew, and people knew Hebrew, and they were translating. I knew very few words. I remember the first words he said, "Ani nirgash meod," which means I'm very moved. And he started speaking about Hanukkah. And
was he Israeli?
And he was a British tourist. And YuliyEdelstein was right near me. And we all were looking. Actually, I think YuliyEdelstein knows. I'm not sure who. One of the people were translating. And then the KGB broke in. Yes, it was the first time the KGB was. Yes.
Scary?
Yeah, but not so scary. Yeah,
Why?
I have to say it was not so scary.
Why?
Because, so some other people were some other refusing. They said, you know what, we're going to call, the American embassy. We're going to speak to Jimmy Carter, blah, blah, blah. And the KGB was it was a detente. It was very different. They were very gentle, relatively gentle. They were arresting people, but it was like a kind of a gentle situation. But just to mention to you, the mysterious way that God runs this world, many years later. How many years later? If that was 1970, let's say 7. And I came to Israel in 1981, and 83, I got married. So 15 years later, I got married. And my British wife and I, first Shabbos after the wedding. And my wife says, you know what? a friend of mine wants to come with her husband to us for Shabbat dinner. We're having Shabbat dinner, right? And I said, of course. And the person walks into the room, and I look at this guy who, when the KGB came, and then they said, okay, we're giving you a few minutes to prepare your documents. And at that moment, I told him, run for your life. I told this British guy, because the door was open and the KGB was in the room. I said, you tried to escape. And he escaped, and he was not arrested. Actually, I didn't know. Many other people who tried to escape were arrested on the street. Edelstein was actually arrested on the street, not my home. But
what happened?
He disappeared.
But don't stop this story.
Yeah.
When you're arrested by the KGB,
it depends.
What happens to you?
It depends. Every story is individual. But I want to.
I finished this one.
Yeah. So what happens with this guy, this British guy? I didn't know his name. Actually, didn't have time to ask his name even. He said beautiful things, and disappeared, vanished into the night. And for 15 years, I never heard who he was.
He's the guy who walks on the door.
He is the husband of my wife's best friend.
I get chills, Aryeh.
And you know what, believe it or not, something else. There is a Jewish college in Jerusalem called Neve Yerushalayim, the House of Jerusalem. And this is a college for young Jewish women who are searching for their spirituality and come from all over the world, even from Soviet Union as well, FSU, thank God, former Soviet Union. And this particular Rabbi Katzin, one of the heads of this college until today. My own daughter, who wanted to increase her Jewish awareness, decided to go to that very college. They're different levels. And I called Rabbi Katzin. Rabbi Katzin, you remember me? You remember you came to my home in Moscow? My daughter is coming to your class. Can you imagine?
How proud is? How proud?
I just think that's you need to live long enough to see.
And the circle of Jewish life.
That the circle continues on. So a year later, I'm already much more versed. I know what holidays are. I know more about Hanukkah.
How do you learn?
Essas
How do you learn?
Essas gives a class. We have other classes.
You study with him?
I study with him.
He
I
was
have
learned.
my own Hebrew classes. I already fluently speak Hebrew. I learned
really?
Fluently Hebrew. Yeah,
You're soaking this up, aren't you?
Absolutely, yes. I'm just making it up. But the truth is, in a few weeks, we really, on Friday nights, we created special Friday nights gatherings where people came and spoke only Hebrew. Yosef Begun used to come to us. It was Hebrew spoken, Dvar Torah in Hebrew, everything else in Hebrew. We created Hebrew-speaking environment by us on Friday. Every Friday night, we had a place to come, and every Thursday night, we have a class. So now Hanukkah. Next year's Hanukkah. And at that time, I have to tell you that, wow, this is what I have to tell you is something I have chills myself. Something remarkable. There many miracles that we went through. You and me obviously went through many miracles in life. But one of the miracles that actually the person I'm going to speak to you about, one of the people I'm going to speak to you about, I interviewed him in Russian language on UTV. His name was Gennady. Today he's Gidon. And he spoke to this story that I'm saying was... So when I came to college, I remember to Moscow Telecommunication Institute, I knew nothing about being Jewish, obviously. And there is a guy standing, in front of the room where I also needed to come. He introduced himself as Gennady, and I introduced myself as Lev. And he told me, we understand each other. Let's skip this first lecture. It's so symbolic. To skip the first lecture. Now, we are really free, correct? I said, okay, let's go to drink beer, he offers me. I was not much in drinking, but why not? And we became friends. He's a musician. He loved singing. I loved drums and piano. He said, let's make a rock band. Great idea. We made a rock band. I was playing drums and he was singing. And then he says to me, you know what? The KGB approached me. And they wanted me to be a spy and work for them. What did you answer? I love it. Because they're going to give me A, B, C, and D, so many benefits. I love it, but I need to pass the interview. Okay, he comes back to me and says, they asked me a strange question. Who's the communist leader of Israeli Communist Party? Who's the leader of Israeli Communist Party? I told him, of course, Meir Wilner. Everybody knows because in every newspaper they write about how he condemns Israel. And he says, I didn't know. I said, because you're not Jewish. That's why you don't know. And he says, that's what they told me, but my mother is Jewish. But she just raised me as Russian. She has, she didn't want me even to know I'm Jewish. So I have documents, I'm Russian, everything is Russian. Oh, so they recruited him to be a spy. But we're friends, nevertheless. And he speaks to me about how he goes to Moscow shul and how they teach him how to fight and how they actually arrest people. And when the refuseniks or other Jews resist, how they use force and how they beat them up, how they throw them cars, how they bring them the KGB. He's a secret agent working for the KGB as a volunteer for now. And I'm telling him about these things that I learned. And I say, I saw such an amazing book, Exodus by Leon Uris. It was an underground book. And I'm telling him, I'm reading this about Israel, how I love Israel. And he loves KGB. And the two of us love music. And we're friends. But our ways, our path, go very much in different direction, because I now go to Moscow shul to stand where he goes to arrest. And he tells me, don't go now because, you may be arrested. And you see, by the way, you see this guy, and you see this guy. Be careful with these guys. And then the next year, I'm talking about the following year, he's saying to me, final test, thank God. I will just pass this final test. I will be a formal member of the KGB force, which means the dream. I'm joining the secret police, the mafia. And the only thing I need to do, it will be Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. And I will have to not just stand outside, but to come inside and sit on the bench quietly. And they gave me the assignment just to wait and see until someone's going to come and offer, like they actually offered me. Oh, young man, do you want to study Hebrew? Maybe you want to study Torah? Say yes. Take the number, take the name. I'll contact you and give all the names to us. And he was prepared to do just that. He came to do that. Rosh Hashanah, he sits in Moscow shul as a spy. A Jew was ordered to come to Moscow synagogue as a spy for the KGB to find out who are the Jews who are helping other Jews to be Jewish. But he's a musician, and he never heard Jewish music. And suddenly the choir, it's Moscow choir synagogue, the choir sings Jewish melodies that he never heard. And his heart is melting. Something is happening to him. The music is speaking to him. And maybe my stories also speak to him as well. And then there is a sound that he was not able to understand what is that sound is all about. It was something that resembled a cry of a baby. A cry that was screaming to him. And he heard this voice. A traitor. Are you spying on your nation? Are you spying on your brothers? He started crying right at the synagogue. Ran out without making a list. Comes to me on Rosh Hashanah. Where I was on Rosh Hashanah? Home. Why didn't I go to synagogue? He told me not to go. I was home. He walks into my home and says, please teach me Hebrew. First thing, I want to be Jewish. Teach me more. Of course, it was a long way because his mother, I have to say, was very scared. Obviously, she complained to KGB about us. Our problems began right immediately. She went to the Russian army and said, save my son from Zionists. Please take him to the army. In order to take him to the army, they needed also to bring him to a hospital to evaluate because a person, and he started praying, and he started putting tefillin. And he comes there with tefillin and praying. They look at him and they say, oh, probably he's crazy, right? He's probably crazy. They look at him. And Friday night, he already, in a few months already, he knew what it is. He sits at the table with a crazy house, how it's called mental institution with really crazy people, and eats Afghan olives because it was the only kosher food for him. Why Afghan olives? Because he thought these are the fruits that the land of Israel is famous for. And he sings Shabbat songs. He's a singer. and he sings Shabbat songs. Another boy comes to him and says, I heard my grandfather doing this. Can I join you? And the two of them sit together. Then the two of them come to me to study. One was Gennady, who became Gidon, and another one was Igor, who became later on Chaim. So Gidon and Chaim, I am coming back to Hanukkah. Gidon and Chaim, and about other 35 young Russian Jews, sitting at my home on Hanukkah. And we have Hanukkah class. It was Thursday night. Essas is giving a class. He's speaking about Hanukkah. And about 7:30 he began the class and he said, why Hanukkah is not just the holiday of lights, but also Hanukkah is the holiday of oil. Like we tend to understand it is because the miracle happened with oil, but there is another reason, he says to us. Because indeed, the Jewish king was anointed with oil, and the Jewish state was reestablished, and the kingdom was reestablished. Therefore, Hanukkah is a symbol of us Jews reestablishing our Jewish homeland. As he was saying that, the knock on the door. Well, which is normal because 35 people are here, and another maybe 6 are still late and are coming. And Gena sits right near me on my right, near the door. I told him, Gena, open the door. Gena gets up to open the door, and he asks, who is there? And the person there says, me. He looks in a hole, and he doesn't see anybody. So he wanted to open a little bit the door and see who is there, but he just unlocked the door. They slammed, and he flew with great noise, like BAM! We heard inside, like something happened. And the next moment, you see the police, KGB guys rushing into the room. And that's probably the first time I felt how the soul sinks. The soul sinked. And they screamed, don't move, hands on the table, started collecting the evidence of criminal activity, Sidurim, right, prayer books or whatever we use for the Hanukkah. And they said, okay, everybody is to follow us to the police station to identify who you are. I'm actually answering your question, what happens to these people? If you have your identity cards, which is a passport, you don't need to go anywhere. Just show, and we'll come to you when we want to, because we know who you are. But if you don't have passport, you need to follow us. One of our friends who was actually a convert, who was a famous lawyer who became a righteous Jew, he turns to them and says, do you have a judge order, or how it's called, judge, permission to do what you're doing? Like, why are you doing it? They say, respect us because we are powerful. He says, you're violating your own Soviet constitution and your own Soviet law. Just, shut up or we're going to use force against you. And basically, people did not get up and follow them. They did not, because they said, anybody does not have passport, follow us. People are sitting. They say, okay, we're giving you 5 minutes. Either you follow us or we'll use force. And there are many of us. There's a bus of police, the house is surrounded, and whatever it is. So they walked away from the room, and they opened a little bit the door, just to make sure we don't lock it. And everybody's looking at our teacher, Eliyahu Essas. And he continued the class very calmly and quietly. He continued the class. And he said that thousands of years ago, there were Greeks who did not allow us to practice our Judaism and be free Jews. Now, to illustrate that, we have these gentlemen outside the door doing exactly the same thing. But the holiday of light represents the idea that we'll overcome darkness and we will come to the land of Israel. We will enjoy the reestablishment of the life in our own Jewish state. And as he was saying it, obviously he spoke like for 5-10 minutes, they broke in and started arresting people. So the first miracle, as you saw, Gennady, was already fully Jewish, so to speak. He was a soldier. But the other guy, Chaim, Igor, he was not really interested at all yet. He was like a newcomer. And the first time he came to me, he said, you know what, my grandfather did it, but I'm interested only in yoga. I'm a yog. I said, maybe you know a little bit more about, your name is Briskman and your grandfather, knew more than all of us about Shabbat. Maybe you want to know more about Shabbat or Hebrew language? No. And then he said, only on one condition. I'm going to teach you yoga and you're going to teach me Judaism. I said, a deal. And I'm very glad and thankful to him. He started teaching me meditation and other stuff, and I started teaching him Hebrew. But it was just a few classes. And he obviously wasn't wearing any yarmulkes, not at all. But for that class, there were yarmulkes outside, and he decided to put on his head. And then the KGB came. And when they left, I hid him in a different room. But when the KGB started searching the apartment, they found him. And a few other people who had passports were still sitting there. Yosef Begun actually was in the room. And when they caught him and they were taking him out of this room, and he was very scared, Yosef Begun turned to KGB guys and said, what are you doing? Did you ever read the diary of Anna Frank? You're taking a guy from hiding. What do you do? What did he do? My mother also turned to these KGB guys and said to them, he wasn't supposed to be here. He never came. He has nothing to do with us. Just came, it was a mistake. Please, do me a favor. Let him go. Oh, yes, we will. They put everybody on the bus and put him in a separate car. And they made a whole theater. Oh, we are driving. We're getting very, very serious criminal. They said on the radio, and they put him in Lefortovo headquarters of the KGB and brought him into the basement. And infamous KGB interrogator by the name Boris, everybody heard who he was. He was interrogating Jewish activists. He saw him, he said, please sit down. So my friend Igor took off his coat and did not take off his yarmulke. He never did it. He never was wearing yarmulke before. So the KGB guy says, you forgot to remove something from your head. And the guy's not moving. He said, should I help you? And he takes a stool. You know what stool is? Yeah, and puts it on his head. Should I help you to remove it? You remove yourself. And he puts his glasses, because to find new glasses in Russia is very hard. But he did not remove his yarmulke. I don't know why. To summarize the story, when many years later, Eliyahu Essas will leave Soviet Union and move to Israel, he will have to decide who will be the head of the entire underground network of Soviet Jewry. Igor Chaim Briskman will become the chief rabbi of Russia. Wow. This guy. Gidon, to tell you, just to make a full story, Gidon later on would be arrested together with YuliyEdelstein. He's a speaker of Knesset today. Both of them were arrested, accused of using drugs. Drugs were obviously implanted to both of them. But Edelstein received jail. And this guy, my friend Gidon, Gena, did not receive jail term, because since he was in a mental health institution for the Soviet army, and they looked at him as a religious Jew, and they gave him a diagnosis, whatever it was, schizophrenia on religious, whatever it is, ideals, or whatever it was, they immediately put him in mental institution, which meant really jail for life. Many years later, he will come to America with his American wife and children, many years later. And he would sit near me on my table at my home. And the first time, in front of his wife, he would recall what happened in this institution, because his wife never heard. It's like Holocaust survivors don't speak about it. And he was crying with tears, saying that they were killing him, they were murdering him, because they were giving him psychotropic medication that was slowly killing his brain. And he was in horrible pain, he was gaining weight, and he understood he was about to die. The only thing about the Soviet Union, probably in modern Russia as well, it's a very corrupted country. So his mother, in a way, changed her position And instead of asking the Soviet army and Soviet government to save him from Zionists, he came to this institution, actually bribed people, and then slowed the dose, and then said that now he's fine, and they released him, and he immigrated to Israel as well. Today he lives in Queens, and it's another miraculous story. But the most important thing, if not for the KGB, how we need to praise the KGB and the maror, the bitter herbs. If not for the KGB ordering him to go to Moscow synagogue on the Rosh Hashanah, spy on the Jews, he would probably never discover his Jewishness. So in a way, they're just a hand. No, they just use as a hand.
These are riveting stories. Most of us know none of this. You know how much I love you and how much I've learned from you and how sharing life with you has been a joy. We have only scratched the surface. So you'll come back and we'll continue?
God willing. Thank you.
Chapter 1 with Aryeh Katzin, Executive Director of RAJE, the Russian-American Jewish Experience. He's the editor of Yeresky Mir. He's the founder and dean of Sinai Academy in Brooklyn, New York. And he is a committed, passionate, wonderful Jew who came out of a horrific experience. And we've only touched the surface, so scratch the surface. So stay with us. We'll have part 2 for you.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to part 2 of my meeting with a Jewish hero, a real Jewish hero, Rabbi Aryeh Katzin. In addition to being founder of the Sinai Academy, a junior high school and high school for Russian immigrants in Brooklyn, New York, in addition to being the founding editor of Yeresky Mir, a major Russian language weekly Jewish newspaper here in America, and Yeresky Mir in English means Jewish World, and in addition to being the executive director of RAJE, the Russian-American Jewish Experience, which does wonderful work, exciting Jewish engagement among young Jews from the former Soviet Union. In addition to all that and more, if you were with us for part 1 of my L'chaim meeting with Aryeh Katzin, you know Aryeh Katzin is a hero of the Soviet Jewry movement, which literally resurrected a dormant Jewish community to become one of the most vibrant and dynamic pillars of Jewish life today in Israel and here in the United States. And American Jews know some of the high-profile names of the refusnik movement of the late 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. We all know Anatoly Sharansky, who took the name Natan Sharansky after making Aliyah and becoming a leading figure in the state of Israel. We know the name Ida Nudel. We know the names Yosef Begun and YuliyEdelstein and Yosef Mendelevich. Well, Aryeh Katzin was a 17 and 18-year-old student in Moscow teaching Hebrew to Yosef Begun and YuliyEdelstein. And the contribution Aryeh has made to Jewish life is simply never-ending. And he also is a most lovely, wonderful human being, a deeply committed Jew, and I am humbled and honored to tell you, he is a dear and beloved friend. It is so wonderful to have you at this table again. Thank you for joining me a second time, Aryeh.
Thank you so much. I also have to say the same words that your beloved friend, and I would say a boss for about quarter century. You did not, I believe.
It is true. I am very lucky.
You're so humble that you did not say
well,
that it did. You asked me about quarter century ago to start the Russian Jewish TV show that I continue to do for you for so many years.
Yes, I am honored you do it. Tree of Life is in English. In Russian it is called?
Дерево жизни.
Yes.
And another thing, I have to humble myself and say that indeed Yosef Begun and YuliyEdelstein were very close friends. And they did come to my home, and we were all together learning and growing spiritually. But YuliyEdelstein taught me Hebrew. He was on a high level.
That's lovely. But the last time we were together, you talked about the evening, I guess it was, that the KGB
Correct.
came into your home.
Right.
Edelstein was there and Begun was there.
Well, Edelstein was a previous Hanukkah, which was also raided by the KGB, and then he was arrested first time, and Yosef Begun was the second year afterwards, and he was under arrest with everybody else. Yes. Yeah, but they were my teachers and very close friends as well.
But you also taught them.
Well,
yes, that's just
okay.
That's how it worked.
Okay,
you know.
Okay, we stand on their
Yes.
shoulders.
But you were, by the way, a kid, 17, 18 years old. Yes.
Correct. I still feel the same.
Good for you.
Yes.
Good for you. Look, we spoke a lot the first time about how you became involved in Jewish life, because you described how you started basically without any knowledge at all. If people have missed the first part, I loved it where your teacher, Eliyahu Essas, says to you, I will only teach you if you become a teacher, because I only teach teachers. And you said to him, I don't know anything. He said, look, if you know lesson 5, you can teach lesson 1. When you know lesson 6, you can teach lesson 2. That is so Jewish, is it not yet? The teacher is learning with the student. We learn with our students. Da?
Yes.
Yes. And also, as long as we can stay ahead, we have something to impart. And so you have been doing that your whole life. So anyway, you described how you become involved, how you go to the Moscow synagogue, you stand outside because the KGB's inside. You tell this spectacular story about the Jew who was sort of recruited to be a KGB agent, and in the end, he is moved by the music, by Jewish music. Yes?
The melody, yes.
What was his name?
Well, I don't know which name I said. I'll call his Hebrew name today Gidon.
That's correct, Gidon. Yes.
Right.
And he ultimately becomes a leader.
Unbelievable, yes.
Okay.
And you know, this story affects us today.
How?
Here in America.
How?
About 10 years ago, when I was involved in studying RAJE, it was Rosh Hashanah, and young Russian Jews gathered together. And I was telling the story how one of my friends was actually recruited to come as a KGB agent on Rosh Hashanah, that very same day. And I was telling the story how this person, Gidon, got out of the Moscow shul, came to me, how his life turned around, and how he was, yes, tortured later on in a psychiatric hospital, but he made Aliyah, came to the same yeshiva where I was, and later on he returned back to Russia. It was, I believe, 1990. And they created the first youth seminar in the Soviet Union in the city of Yurmala, not far from Riga. It's a very fancy place. They took a hotel, and they invited young Russian Jewish students to come, he's still in the former Soviet Union, and to experience their Jewish heritage. One person sitting in the room, I'm talking about RAJE, who was recently then brought from Israel to be a rabbi.
Let's just make sure everybody understands. RAJE is the Russian-American Jewish experience.
Located in Brighton Beach,
right.
Not in Moscow, and not in Israel.
Right.
So a guy who came with his family just maybe like a year ago to teach young Russian Jews, he was almost shocked. And he said, are you talking about Gidon? I remember myself being at St. Petersburg, still then Leningrad University, studying geography. And I saw this advertisement about the Jewish seminar, and I came to this seminar, and I remember walking into the hall and seeing Gidon singing Jewish songs. And it touched my heart. And I fell in love on the spot with Jewish music and Jewish ideals. And I forgot about my Leningrad University, and I moved to Israel. I made Aliyah, and he became a rabbi. And he came to America, and he's teaching in RAJE until today.
Oh man, what's his name?
Reuven Haskin. Manhattan Beach community knows him well. Many of the RAJE students know him very well. And when I repeat sometimes this story, very often students say, oh, wait a second. If you're telling me the story about what happened 40 years ago in Moscow, it affected me. Because Gideon taught Reuven, and Reuven taught me. So I needed to teach someone else. That's how it goes.
Amazing. Who taught Gideon?
Well, that...
You did.
well, I have to say...
Yes, you did.
I had great help from the KGB.
A marvelous story. I want to take a step back for 1 minute. When you're growing up as a young Jew in Moscow, what do you and your family know, and what does the Shoah, what does the Holocaust mean to you as a young Jew who is not yet really developing a Jewish identity? That happens as you grow. But even when you are 16 or 17, and what is your mother and what do you as a Jew from the former Soviet Union know and experience of the Shoah? To what extent is it a part of your Jewish identity, as it is obviously for European Jewry, and as it has become part of American Jewish identity? To what extent was it then, and has it become even more so for you as an adult living in America?
I'm going to say something which I'm not sure our audience will understand fully. The Shoah was hidden.
Hidden.
In other words, you can come to Babi Yar, where they killed, I don't know, about 100,000 Jews.
In the Ukraine.
And you have no resemblance of the word Jew. You can come to mass graves. You have no memory of Shoah in any of the textbooks, none on TV, never, completely hidden or forgotten or silenced.
Okay, I want to make sure we understand each other. First of all, our viewers should know what we call World War II was not called World War II in the former Soviet Union. It was called the Great Patriotic War, and there's very good reason for that. By the way, as it's just a footnote, you understand better than almost anybody my association with the Russian television network and my involvement with the Russian American. It's the Jewish immigrant community from the former Soviet Union. They are not Russian Jews.
They're Jews from Russia.
Exactly. And I have learned an enormous amount from my contact with them and with you. One of the things that American Jews are brought up on as Americans is that America won World War II. I learned very quickly when I became involved with the Russian Television Network of America that while America did have an absolutely important role, the war wasn't won by America. It was won by the Soviet Union. It was won after Leningrad and after Stalingrad. And that is horrific as the Shoah was. The loss of Russians dwarfs the loss of the Jewish people in the Shoah.
You know the exact number of Soviet citizens died in Shoah? About 30 million, 28 million to be exact.
In the Great Patriotic War, not in the Shoah.
In the Great Patriotic, obviously,
Right.
of course.
Yes, 30 million.
About 30 million people.
Okay, and if one reads the history of Stalingrad or the siege of Leningrad.
That is my family. I mean, my family fought Stalingrad and there was siege in Leningrad and everything else. Well, my grandfather's family. So it's a family heritage. The Great Patriotic War, of course. But there is another reason which I want to bring to your attention as well. The reason until today the Russian diplomacy, let's say, is not using the word Great World War II. Because World War II began in September 1939 by...
When Hitler invaded?
Not only by Hitler.
By
Hitler and Stalin. The reason they're not using it, because yes, they won, but they also started it, together with Hitler.
Is that the Russian
Yes.
identity?
Yes.
The Russian understands they were part of this war.
They definitely understand that in terms of they're not taking responsibility for starting this war.
Why not?
because this is a different question. It's the Soviet Union. It's a very sensitive question. They're not taking responsibility for starting this war. They're probably blaming Stalin for, at that moment, allying with Hitler to attack
So it's not
Poland.
until Germany attacks Russia?
And correct. 2 years
That's
later,
when it becomes the Great Patriotic
absolutely.
War.
2 years later, when suddenly allies fight each other, then it turns into the Great Patriotic War. But in terms of Jewish people were not warned about Germany coming in. They were not taught that Germany is an enemy, that they can kill Jews. Jews were staying in occupation, in occupied territories, because no one was warning them what Adolf Hitler is doing to the Jewish people. But the second, and therefore Soviet Union did not defend their own Jews at that time, did not protect them at that time. No one knew about what they're doing. Okay, but the second part is, I believe, is part of the general crime of communist regime against the Jewish people. They never singled out Jewish tragedy, because Jewish tragedy was very unique. They were killing Jews not like partisans, not like those who stood up to German occupation, but they killed every single Jew just because he was Jewish. And that was not in the open. It was a moment, and I believe I was 6, 7 years old, I believe. It was 1967. My parents took me to a movie called Обыкновенный Fascism by someone by the name Rom. Обыкновенный Fascism, it's like regular Nazism. A person, Russian movie maker, went to Auschwitz, and he just showed what it was. I remember as a child, endless amount of shoes, children's shoes of children that were destroyed by the Nazis. And it made a tremendous impact on me. I remember Yosef Begun later on told me that when he saw that very movie and he left the movie theater, he said, never again, to himself. How can I continue life after this Holocaust the same way? So therefore, in a way, awakening of the Russian Jewry in the 60s began when they came to Babi Yar monument or to other monuments in Minsk, and they tried to show respect to the memory of their loved ones. And they were stopped by the KGB or police. And that's how the collision and therefore the struggle for immigration began. Mm-hmm. So if you're asking me, did it play any role? We were robbed of anything. We knew absolutely nothing. I knew not about Pesach, not about Yom Kippur, not about Rosh Hashanah. I maybe ate matzah, but I had nothing. However, one book played a tremendous role in my life. It was Joseph Flavius, The Judean War. Not by Joseph Flavius himself, but by German writer Leon Feuchtwanger, who retell this story of Joseph Flavius in a story way. And when I read it first time, I believe I maybe was like 13 or 14 years old, I suddenly felt that the only reason I live in Moscow and I see these anti-Semites around me and the kids talking about pogrom and, if you're a Jew, you're reminded constantly you're a Jew. I felt myself, in a way, a victim, but of a greater Holocaust that happened 2,000 years ago. And I said, if not for Titus expelling us from Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, I would not be here in Moscow. Why am I here? What am I doing here? I'm out of place. And therefore, my dream to come back to Jerusalem and to come back to Israel, I'm still living this dream. Mm-hmm. And 3 of my sons are living in Jerusalem today, in Israel today. One in the Israeli army, another one is learning Torah in a yeshiva, a third one is working as an attorney. But even though they were raised in America, some of them were born in America, we share this passion of love for Israel. That, I believe, began then.
Very interesting. I want to come back to this. Are you saying to me that not only did you did not know about what the Jewish holidays were, you also had no knowledge before this movie that the Jews had been singled out?
Of course, I was 7 years old when I came. I knew
that's
very little.
Right, yeah.
We knew that our families were destroyed. We knew that, but what extended, what the Holocaust was, and how the Germany wanted to destroy Jews and why, and especially in a realm of Jewish history in general, and inquisitions and pogroms.
Yes.
I want to tell you one thing I do remember. My grandmother used to tell me about pogroms in Kiev and how her Christian neighbors were hiding her, putting a cross to make sure she's not going to be murdered.
Which years? What decade?
Well, I believe it was probably 1904. No, 1913. It was Baylis.
Okay.
It was Baylis, 1913.
Okay.
And she said she saw how all her neighbors were put outside and killed and murdered, or the neighbors from the house in front of her eyes. So where we live, I understood very well.
Okay. American Jews, if you ask most American Jews, and you have a good sense of what American Jewry is, see if you agree with me. If you ask most American Jews, what's the image that comes to your mind when you talk about the Shoah? What comes to mind is Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is in Poland. There were concentration camps in Poland and in Germany, and the concentration camp is the symbol for most American Jews of what the Shoah is. What is interesting to me is that if one studies the history of the Shoah and of World War II, Great Patriotic War, one realizes that it's horrific. They were horrific. Auschwitz was a camp set up to murder people in an industrial rate. It was almost incomprehensible even now to imagine human beings devising a way to kill as many Jews as they can, tens of thousands in a hurry, every day. But the reality is that the amount of death inflicted upon the Jewish people, not in the Europe that we imagine, but in the Soviet Union, and in the Soviet bloc, and in Ukraine, and in other countries far east, it was systematic. It was not by mechanisms. It wasn't by gas. It wasn't by crematorium. It was somebody looking at you in the eye or in your back and shooting you dead into a pit. SS job was one thing: kill Jews, murder Jews in as large numbers as possible with machine guns. That's not the image Jews have of the Shoah.
My childhood memories, I remember standing near my mother, I believe maybe I was like 5 or 6 years old, in a store near Kremlin. And a woman said to us, "What a pity Hitler didn't kill you all." Well, I didn't understand yet. My mother had to explain me what's going on. But the truth is, what Hitler did not do, Stalin and followers continued to do in a different way. In other words, what Hitler wanted to do in a physical sense, destroying every single Jew, Stalin in a way did a better job in turning Jews into Soviet robots, willing and ready to fulfill his orders, whatever the orders were. So he was robbing Jews of their Jewish identity, destroying the Jewish theater, the Jewish schools, the Jewish literature, poetry, language, everything was robbed. So the fact that 3 million Jews remained in the Soviet Union after the Holocaust only meant that they were slowly to fade away and disappear. And that's why I remember, even though I had a dream of getting out of Russia, and I remember for me, like, it's a transformational moment in my life. I was on the bus in Moscow. It was pretty much maybe late at night, and I saw a moon from the bus. Can you see, like, from the window of the bus, I see a moon. What a person thinks about when he sees a moon. I was thinking about a strange question. I applied to immigrate to Israel already for a number of years. I was not able to get out, and I didn't know what I can do. And I said to myself, even if I would want to reach the moon, I know what to do. At least I know to become a pilot or maybe become a cosmonaut, and I can maybe one day travel to moon. But I absolutely have no clue what to do to get out of this USSR to go to my land of Israel. I was very frustrated. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I looked at the person sitting near me. And he looked like a regular Soviet citizen, a young fellow, maybe a few years older than me. But his nose, the shape of his nose, was giving away his identity. And I'm by nature a very shy person, I have to tell you. And I don't speak to strangers. And I suddenly said to myself, I said, you know what? If you cannot change the circumstances, maybe you have to change your attitude. Viktor Frankl actually said that, but this is kind of thought. I cannot get out of Russia. For what purpose? I cannot get out of Russia. And I said, probably if American Jews or Israeli Jews would be able to sit on my seat right here, realizing there are 3 million Jews in captivity. And they are like suffocating. It's just a matter of time, will all vanish and will disappear. And I happen to be here in this very advantageous position. I sit here on a bus, and right near me is a Jewish person. Why I'm not taking an opportunity and just reaching out to him? And I turned to him and I said, you know, I went to, it was like a book show in Moscow, international book show, and I had an Israeli sign with Magen David. I said, you know what? Do you know what it is? He looked at me and said, yeah, it's an Israeli. I said, yeah, you know what? I'm Jewish. He said, okay, I'm Jewish too. I said, what? Maybe you want to come to me, we'll drink tea and talk about Israel. I didn't do it before. First time in my life, I just reached out. His name is Meir Zolotarevsky, Mark Zolotarevsky. As a matter of fact, when Yosef Begun had nowhere to go, when we left, he moved to him. Meir Zolotarevsky became one of my friends. He continued to learn Torah, Judaism. He moved to Israel. He lives in Israel. It was maybe one of the first victories when I reached out to someone who I never knew. In business, we call it cold calling. But I was motivated just by feeling he's a Tinok Shenishba. How do we say Tinok Shenishba? He is like all of us, Russian Jews. We are grandparents, our grandparents and great-grandparents were great people, were devoted Jews, were Jews who loved their communities and their families. And just the Holocaust, the physical German Holocaust and the spiritual Holocaust of Stalin robbed us of our past and therefore our future, of our identity, our thoughts, our feelings, our heritage. So what we need to do to take them out of captivity? How do you do it? Share with them the wealth of knowledge. So I invited this guy to come. And I think that all my life, if anything, I can tell you, like what are the most amazing moments of my life? I would say it's a revelation of the hidden. It's a revelation of the hidden. This guy was a hidden Jew. He didn't know himself about it, but he had such an amazing heart. And he fell in love with Judaism, which he didn't know about. And maybe in a way it was a meeting that later on, when I already went to Yeshiva, you remember when Yosef reveals himself to the brothers. Remember the story? Yosef reveals himself to the brothers. And he sees his brother Binyamin. And what does he do? He hugs him and he cries on his neck. And Binyamin cries on Yosef's neck. And they cry, embracing each other. And the rabbi said, this is a prophecy, how two kinds of Jews will meet. A Jew who continued the heritage of his father Binyamin, who never lost the family. And a lost Jew, Yosef, who was in captivity, and he was kind of raised there, and he was dressed like an Egyptian. And at this moment, when they meet, the blessing that Yaakov received from his father, Yitzhak, while being dressed as Esau. And the rabbi said, you know why he was dressed as Esau? This is exactly the kind of blessing he wanted to receive. The blessing that even if you're far away, even if you're lost, even if you become a traitor, as the rabbi say, nevertheless, you will never be lost completely. You will come back. So this blessing did not realize in his life, but it actually realized in Yosef's life. Yosef dressed like an Egyptian, like Esau. But Binyamin sees him and embraces him. And the two kinds of Jews speak to each other. And I think in anything we do today, what we do even on this show, we want to break this barrier between, so to speak, religious Jews, so to speak, secular Jews, or this kind of Jews, or that kind of Jews. And we want to embrace all Jews as part of one family and share love with them and share respect with them.
Oh, that is magnificent. You're magnificent. I also was thinking as you spoke, it is almost a metaphor for what happens to the Jews of the former Soviet Union. They were dressed in Russian garb. They had lost their own identity.
Exactly.
And then there were individuals. First, there was the Six-Day War, which had an enormous impact. And then there were individuals who touched them. So you were able to touch Mark. It was on a bus, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
And Mark became mayor, right?
Yes, yes. And by the way, and people touched you.
Of course.
That's how it happened for you.
But because we have it inside us, because there's some pintalayit or whatever you want to call it. I learned in Slobodka, I know you have also
My grandfather.
Your grandfather of greatness of a Jew. We need to recognize the greatness of his potential. Every person has an amazing potential. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do, we need just to turn them around. I want to give you we'll share one
Please.
I believe amazing story. When I came to America, I felt that nothing changed. Because when I felt that Russian Jews in captivity in Russia was okay, I'm skipping Israeli scenery, is a different maybe program, but right now about America, when I came to America, I said, very strange. It was one Russian newspaper, not to mention the name. At that time specifically, it was funded by Tolstoy Fund, and was in nature very secular, not secular, very Russian ethnically, and very Christian. Because obviously, with all the respect to Christianity in Russian Orthodoxy, in 1917 there was a revolution. Many immigrants came to America, and they established their own immigrant, so to speak, white newspaper. So when Russian Jews come here, the only medium they find is this Russian newspaper, where churches and Greek Orthodox holidays, and absolutely nothing Jewish. I remember coming to these people and trying to tell them, listen, maybe we should make a Jewish page, or doing. They could not change it. They were not willing to change it because that's the way it was. That was the newspaper. I said, okay, then you know what? You're forcing me to start a Jewish newspaper. I never planned to start a Jewish newspaper.
That's how Yevresky Mir comes
Exactly. I said, I have no choice. I had no choice. I have to communicate to parents of my school, because how can I teach children while parents continue to read your newspaper? Different worlds. Let's do it. So I did it. It was never a business idea. It was just whatever it is, a necessity. It was done, and it, Baruch Hashem, thank God, continues for the last 25 years. However, just one example. A few years later, someone by the name Leonid Fondo, I'm mentioning his real name with his permission, is a priest, came from Russia to reach out to Russian Jews in order to convert them to Christianity. He was very successful in Russia. He converted over 3,000 people. And he was actually brought here by a particular missionary organization. And on Ocean Avenue, they started a church for Russian Jews. And there were all kinds of approaches how to fight missionaries and to defend the innocent Russian Jews. And I have to tell you, I was always against any noise and demonstrations, because that's not the way to go. But you'll see how media can actually work wonders. One day he comes to Sinai Academy, the school I was running, and he says to me, the priest comes to me and says, I want to tell you what I did. One day, which was last Sunday, I got up in front of 200 Jews, and I said to them, please follow me, with me, to the synagogue. I am leaving church, I'm going to synagogue. What happened? He says, you know what? I needed to make my sermons. And in order to prepare sermons, I started buying your newspaper. And I was reading Torah articles, article after article. Of course, he also created friendships, and there were wonderful Jews who were helping him to understand, and obviously he was Jewish himself. So one day, he becomes a leader, and he continues to be involved in an amazing way to help Russian Jewish community today. Today, his name is Moshe Fondo, who can tell about how he was probably the most successful priest, missionary in Russian language, who just discovered hidden Jew within himself. We talk about the power of media. The same newspaper, Yevresky Mir, obviously for many years has a website. And interesting enough, maybe 5-6 years ago, people started sending me questions about Torah articles from Moscow. I'm just giving you one example of how we can reveal the hidden, maybe even somewhere near Kremlin or maybe in Kremlin. It's unbelievable. I'm not at liberty to reveal the names here, but a person asks questions about Torah, and then we become friends, And then we continued to have a conversation. Professor says, when I was 18, I joined Spetsnaz of GRU. I'll translate what it means. It's like Navy SEALs of Russian military intelligence. And I was sent to Afghanistan, and I fought the entire war. And then I was sent to Karabakh, Azerbaijan-Armenian war, and then I was sent to Chechen war. And later on, he became a general of Russian military intelligence, very close person to Vladimir Putin, part of the Kremlin circle. Nobody knows he's Jewish. But he discovered his Jewishness, because indeed, there are Jewish roots that he's not putting in the open, and he's with thirst studying Judaism online.
Amazing story.
It's just another so to speak, miracle of the. Since I'm speaking about Vladimir Putin and our, so to speak, relationships in this regard, my first job in America was for the State Department, Information Agency. I was interviewed by the Voice of America, and they said, please, can you do weekly programs for us? And I started doing programs. The difficulty of making programs, I'm sure you share this with me, because you don't know how many people are listening. Is anybody listening and watching it all? How do you know it impacts anybody, right? It's very difficult to say. So one day, I discovered the impact. A rabbi from Moscow, who was the head of the yeshiva in Moscow, someone Yosef Amzel, comes to me with a letter from his student in Moscow. And he, in perfect Hebrew, writes a thank you letter to me. Thank you, opened my eyes. Okay? Later on, this person moved to Israel. I met him, and he revealed the story to me. His father was the head of Soviet military intelligence in East Germany. As you know, Erich Honecker, who was the head of the Communist Party, who he was? He was the KGB agent. This is a known fact, and he actually received orders from the KGB. So the KGB, what happened? The KGB head at his home receives the head of the East Germany, and they talk. While their son, today Menashe, sits in another room and listens to my Voice of America program. And he asks his mother, please tell me, what about our grandparents? Where are they from? The father was Russian. The mother was Jewish. And she didn't want to reveal her Jewishness to the son. But she said, my parents were in ghetto. What is ghetto? Who was sent in the ghetto? So he discovers he's Jewish. He listens to Voice of America. And when the Soviet Union collapses, meaning even before, when the Russian army retreats to back to Moscow, he goes back to Moscow, the father puts him in a hospital to try to break him, but he goes back to Israel.
Amazing. So, what made you think that story in this context?
Because, again, it's I have to give the credit to you, because you are a pioneer of Jewish media in America. So we cannot reach every single person in person by personal touch. Not everybody sits near me on the bus, correct? Not everybody is in your community in Stanford, right? But when you make a program, you reach so many people. You plant the seeds. And then some seeds reach, who knows where.
You're exactly correct. All right, I want to come back to your story for a minute. So you said, you always wanted to go to the state of Israel. You want to go to Israel. And it was harder in your mind than going to the moon.
Right.
I want you to tell us again, how do you become aware of the importance of Israel when it wasn't something you were born with? Do you remember roughly when you say to yourself for the first time, I want to be in Israel, and then I want to hear the story, how do you finally make it? How do you finally get from the Soviet Union to Israel?
Yeah, it's. I think first of all, there's really no rational explanation. Love is something that is irrational by nature. I think that at the same time when I felt, as I told you, that I'm out of place here in Moscow and really I belong in Israel, that was a feeling.
How old are you?
Probably was like bar mitzvah age, I believe. Yeah. At very same time, I also, I believe I told the last time, I asked my grandma, "What do you think about Israel?" And she said, "Oh, I would go there, right, by foot. I would go. I would just walk there." And
you decided then you had to be there.
And I decided then, as you remember, I believe I said that we were sitting around the table on the New Year's party in 1977. No, 1973. It was turning 1974, and when everyone had a wish, my wish was next year in Jerusalem. Of course, there were many years of struggle, to fulfill this dream. And
how does it finally happen?
It happened, like King David says, "Hayinu kecholmim." It was a dream.
As if you were in a dream.
It was a dream. Why was it a dream? Because in 1981, was such a bad time for the Jews in Russia. And it seemed like totally and absolutely impossible to leave Soviet Union. And when suddenly, basically like out of nowhere, we received this permission to immigrate, meant like very few people in Moscow at that time. It was simply a dream that I could not believe in. I wasn't able to believe, I didn't believe it. Even, even when I was getting in the airplane, I said to myself, I can't believe it.
Where were you when you got
because they can turn the plane around. Seriously, only when it landed.
Okay. Where were you when you got the news?
Well, obviously I was living in Moscow. And
where were you? At home?
No. That.
And what, you get a letter?
It was a letter. You have to come to a place. Yeah, that's a miraculous story in itself. Yeah, I'm not sure it's even. Yeah, it's beyond words. Beyond words, because you needed to bring all kind of documents, and we left instead of maybe taking a few months to leave. I believe it was like 2-3 days, and on Purim, 1981, I received my visa, and the next day I was on the plane.
Next day?
Next day we were on the plane. Yeah, just
with whom?
With my mother and grandmother. So that's.
They were ready to go. They were ready to
go.
Oh,
absolutely. KGB helped everybody to recognize that it's not a place to stay. And
was there a reason you received the visa?
I believe at that time, when they basically closed the immigration, they decided these people we don't want to see, let them go.
They didn't want you there.
And other people who they wanted to use just to warn others went to jail. Some of our friends went to jail.
So you were lucky.
I was lucky.
You could have gone to jail.
Absolutely, of course.
Instead, they said, "We want you out."
They just they just threw few people out, few people in jail, and it stopped for a number of years.
You're on the plane. You're saying, "I'm not going to believe it till it lands."
I wasn't able to believe it.
It was at Lud Airport.
But in a way, you know what? Maybe I'll tell you something important now. When I came to Israel, obviously it was a crisis of identity. What do I do next? Because I was in college. I wanted to become a scientist. I loved physics. I also, whatever it is, I had my dreams.
You were not yet becoming a rabbi.
What are you talking about, Rabbi? I was studying here or there underground with few tourists who were coming.
But that was not your goal.
Oh, no. It was a moment, you're asking a good question. It was a moment, again, I'm not getting into, but it was a moment where it was this 1980 when Olympic Games, and the KGB was trying to push all the Jews out, and they were scaring everyone that they will be arrested if they're not leaving Moscow. But at that day, at that time, it was a very scary moment for me. And I thought I'm dying. And I said to myself, oh God, only if I survive, I will dedicate my life to teaching Torah. I don't know why this thought came to my mind. I don't know. But I forgot about it. When I came to Israel.
What do you mean you were dying? What do you mean you felt you were dying?
It was a moment. It was something happened to my heart.
I see. It was physical.
It was physical. It was not. It was. We needed to move out of Moscow, so I was carrying something very heavy. It fell on me. Something happened to me, just physical, and I ended up in a hospital, second hospital, third hospital, whatever it was. It was a moment I was losing my consciousness. Yes, Yes, was taken by the ambulance thinking I have a heart attack, even though I was like 19 years old. But at that moment, I said to myself, only if I'll survive, I will dedicate my life to teaching Torah. But when I came to Israel, all the doors are open. I learned a little bit in the yeshiva, Slobodka, a little bit. And I said to myself, well, I say Slobodka Ateret Yisrael specifically.
Yeah,
but then I said to myself, wait a second, there's a war in Lebanon. My friends went to fight the war. Some of my friends already were in the Israeli army. I also want to join the Israeli army. And I quit yeshiva and I went to Israeli. I wanted to go to Israeli army. By the time I already wanted to go, but by that time the war was over. And I asked myself, what do I do next? So I registered to Technion, to Tel Aviv University, to Hebrew University, to Bar Ilan University, to Ben Gurion University. I loved everything. And they accepted me everywhere. In Moscow, they didn't want to accept me. Here I was accepted everywhere. What do I do? And at that moment, I have to give credit to my mother. She saw how I was fighting. So what is my mission in life? Should I just continue on with my life, my career, thinking about me? While Yosef Begun is in jail, when others go to teach Torah classes and they don't know if they will be safe and free, or I will join them or not. And after a struggle, I remember it was Simchat Torah holiday. My mother told me, you know what, enough is enough. You need to go back to yeshiva. And I went back to that yeshiva. And I said, well, okay, I'll learn another year. So in terms of what to do, I felt similar feelings about Russian Jews in Israel. And when I came to America again, I was on the mission actually to reveal, so to speak, the hidden identity of the Russian Jews and allow them to come out. Mm-hmm. And I wanted maybe just to illustrate American story. One idea of illustration of American story. The Sinai Academy, Russian Jewish school, was established in 1987. Years later, I stand in the office. Remember, I'm standing near the office. And a guy comes into the office looking pretty scary, long hair, like, I don't know, like, probably it would be like night. You know what I mean? Like long, like strong, high, strong built boy, maybe like he's 16 or 17 years old. And I wasn't sure, did he come to register to school, or maybe he was looking for a job? I don't know what he wants. And my secretary turns to me and says, by the way, this boy, yes, he wants to register to Sinai Academy, but the grandmother of somebody sent us a message that this boy is really no good. Someone sent a message that this boy, don't accept this boy, because come from bad background. He's gonna influence negatively students. After this introduction, like, do you take a student who? And I look at him and I ask him, so what do you want? I want to register to your school. I would like to. Where are you coming from? New Trick High School. Tough school in Brooklyn. And he saw my hesitation, and he turns to me and says, he says, my aunt, Regina. He says, wait a second. She works for you in Еврейский мир. I said, are you kidding? Because she told me that she has a relative, uncle, by the name Rabbi Avram Shor. Avram Shkop, one of the students of the Briskirov Soloveitchik, was a famous Rosh Yeshiva, Reb Shimon Shkop, in Lithuania, one of the great Slobodka minds. Reb Shimon Shkop, a genius, Einstein of his generation. And all my life I was reading his books. And when I needed to give my first class in a yeshiva in Israel, and I was in desperation to find an explanation to a problem that I was giving to solve, and I wasn't able to do it, I just came home, a revelation in my life, and I said to myself, I cannot teach this class because I don't know the answer to this question, what is tartileriusa, whatever it is, whatever the halachic Talmudical problem was. And I was about to give up. And I just I reached out to my small library of books, and I pulled out a book that I didn't know what I'm pulling out. I don't know why I did it. And I just opened it, and I just looked inside, and what's written, Tarte Leriusa is an explanation that made my, how to say, like a bright light. I looked at this. It was amazing. I gave first class. I connected to this book. And I continued to read these books and teach these books. My children had bar mitzvahs, and I taught them from this book. And in my Sinai Academy school, I taught from this book. And it was a student who I wanted to reject, who I was judging because of his appearance. And he says to me, I'm a great-grandchild of the famous Rabbi Shimon Shkop. I said, are you kidding? Are you serious? Come on. I brought him into my office. And I said, let's open his book, Sharei Yosher. I want to show you a few words that Rabbi Shimon Shkop begins his book with a short introduction. And he says that there is a mitzvah, Kedoshim Tiyu, which means be holy. That he explains what really means you should dedicate yourself to Klal Israel. And your passion and love should be love for the Jewish people. I said, this is your grandfather said to me. And this book inspired me. And you are accepted Sinai Academy.
How did he do?
Wonderful. So we're friends today. And he has a wife and 2 children. And we had first bris circumcision and the second bris and circumcision. And he's part of the Jewish family.
You have so many wonderful stories, you know. I want you to tell me what it felt like for you when you step off the plane and now you're in Eretz Yisrael. You've reached the moon. What's it feel like for you?
Well, it's very warm feeling. I'm home. It's a very...
I'm home.
I'm home. I remember every day opening the door on the way to my yeshiva and looking at the wonderful skies of wonderful blue color and not palm trees, the olive trees and the hills, and just seeing this amazing view of the land of Israel. And a strange thought came to my mind that I'm so... I wonder why I'm not stopping wondering, if I'm making sense of what I'm saying in English. I was every day as impressed and excited to see and feel this land. And this feeling did not fade away.
It did not. Where did you live in Israel?
Jerusalem.
Really? Did you enjoy that?
It's still a dream.
It's still a dream. You, of course, went to the Western Wall. There it was. You knew what the Western Wall was, HaKotel. You knew what it was before you saw it. And now you're able to go there and stand there and pray there, yes?
Yes. My maybe most powerful memory of the Western Wall is when many years later, when I came with the RAJE group, already many years later, and I see one of Sinai Academy students whose name was Val Verkhovsky. And when he was at Sinai, you know, he was a regular kid. The only thing he used to say, I'm a descendant of Baal Shem Tov. That's a tradition of the family. And I was like playing with him. You know what? Let me ask you a question. How do you know you're descendant of Baal Shem? Let me ask you a question Baal Shem Tov asked. For instance, why do we need the stories of the life tests of Avram, Isaac, and Yaakov? Why do we need to hear about that? Everybody was thinking, and I remember he said, it's important for us because if they were able to do it, so we can. And I thought that this boy graduated school, he left, he faded away, and I'm not going to see him again. And one day I come to Israel, and the first thing I do, I'm going to the Kotel, the Western Wall, and it's very early in the morning. I came at night, and it's very early in the morning. I just arrive, and it's sunrise. The Tfilat Vatikin, just the first early morning prayers. and I see Rabbi Moshe Shapira. It's like one of the early morning minyanim at the Western Wall. And I see Val Berkovsky, the descendant of Baal Shem Tov. And I say, Valera! It's another moment of revelation of the hidden. The boy who came from Vinnytsia, Ukraine, who claimed, I'm the descendant of Baal Shem Tov, who we thought was lost forever, we're not going to see him again. Suddenly, we see, yes, he went to Israel. Yes, he wanted to discover his Jewish identity. And now, he's there in Israel learning, discovering who he is.
There is a message there, isn't there?
Yes.
About the transcending Jewish soul, yes?
Yes.
And you've been there, you've seen it, you know it.
In a way, King Solomon said in Shir HaShirim, Hashem is looking through this wall at every Jew with love. When we come to the Western Wall, we see something that was never destroyed. They wanted to expel us from the land of Israel. They wanted to destroy the Jerusalem and the temple. But there's something they were not able to destroy. So we need to understand we also have the Holy Soul, and we have the holiest of the holiest within ourselves. And even though we were brainwashed, and there was a Shoah Holocaust, and there was a communist propaganda, there is something like a Western Wall that reminds us about our greatness of the past, about our royalty, about our prophecies of the past, which actually transcend time and project into the future. It really reminds us about our greatness. When we see the kotel, we see ourselves, because God loves every single Jew who comes and touches this kotel. In a way, we can do it in our minds, of course, every time we pray.
You know how much I love you.
Thank
By the
you.
way, this is just part 2. Now we're going to have part 3. You're going to continue to tell your story. You're going to let me continue to probe you and ask you. There's no limit to the good you're doing and that you will do. And I love you so much. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. We will continue part 3. Fair enough?
Thank you.
Okay. So that's part 2 of our meeting together, my meeting with Rabbi Aryeh Katzin, founder of Sinai Academy, of Yevresky Mir, currently the executive director of a fabulous organization, RAJE, the Russian American Jewish Experience. And he's a modern Jewish hero that came out of the Soviet Jewry movement.